them, if doing their work means angering China, then they will very likely be accused of committing a certain crime, and China will be able to find a way to have them extradited to face charges in China, in mainland China. And so what this means is that China will be able to use this bill as retaliation against opponents, whether it's Hong Kong Chinese or foreigners who are traveling to or based in Hong Kong.
Mary, could you explain who's behind this proposed amendment, and why is it being proposed now?
Yes. So really who's behind it is the Hong Kong government, but who's behind the Hong Kong government is the Beijing government. The Hong Kong government has insisted that this is their own initiative. Chief Executive Carrie Lam has repeatedly said that this is her making. The Hong Kong government's making. There is no instruction from the Chinese government, though the top official based in Hong Kong, the top Chinese official, has made the unusual move of trying to persuade Hong Kong politicians to back the extradition bill. So as to whether China really isn't behind this bill is uncertain, and I'm doubtful of that.
Could you describe, Mary, the kinds of the protests that are taking place and the violent crackdown by the police in Hong Kong against the protesters? So the protesters started gathering outside the central government offices on Tuesday night, local time here, and medical supplies. They were erecting barriers around the protest site. They were handing out masks to passers-by. People were insisting that I take their masks as a journalist because they expected tear gas to be fired. And so there was this sense of camaraderie. There wasn't too much really going on at that point. At points, there was a sense of tension as police and the protesters just stood 10 meters away from each other, the front line of protesters, police and riot gear, but really not much happened. And it was not until around 3:30 local time here that clashes broke out. I should say that by that time I'd actually left the protest site and gone back to the newsroom for the day, so I did not personally see the clashes, but from what I've seen online, from videos that I've been watching, it really does not seem like protesters were the ones starting any kind of confrontation with the police. The police were trying to disperse them and ended up aggravating the crowd.
According to the New York Times, it's estimated 1 in 7 Hong Kong residents took part in Sunday's protests. And in the New York Times on Monday, Hong Kong's Commissioner to the United States, Eddie Mack, outlined his government's position, writing, "The Hong Kong government's proposed amendments to extradition laws seek to enable us to effectively combat serious crimes by sealing the legal vacuum in our existing mechanism for surrendering fugitive offenders. Do not pinpoint any particular jurisdiction, nor do they target common citizens or affect the legal rights and freedoms of individuals." If you could respond to that and the fact that what the Chinese authorities have done in the past, for example, the abducting of Hong Kong residents, 5 Hong Kong booksellers in 2015.
Yes, there really is no trust of the Chinese government. With the protesters I've spoken to, that's the one thing really that they've all mentioned when I asked them what about the Hong Kong government's amendments and assurances that your freedoms won't be trampled upon. And time again, the protesters tell me we don't trust the Chinese Communist Party, the Chinese government. It's all a bunch of lies. And so any assurance that the freedom of speech, the freedom of assembly, as they exist in Hong Kong now, will not be trampled upon, I don't think those assurances hold any water.
And those booksellers?
And the booksellers, of course, there is that precedent of Chinese government coming in and essentially launching this global campaign, not just in Hong Kong, but elsewhere, of state-sponsored kidnapping. And so with the booksellers, I think people have looked at that and seen how the Chinese government will behave without an extradition bill legalizing and legitimizing their behavior. And so with the bill, I think what we'll see is just this legitimizing of state-sponsored kidnapping, as some people have called it.
Well, Mary, before we conclude, what do you expect to happen next? Will this amendment pass, and do you expect the protests to continue?
So the debate over the bill in the legislature has been postponed until next week. It's unsure whether protesters again, though my gut feeling is that if the debate is to continue and a vote is taken, it will very likely pass, given that the legislature is stacked with pro-Beijing, pro-China parties and politicians. Should it pass, I'm sure the anger will boil over, the popular anger will boil over, and protesters will be out again to stand for their freedoms.
Mary Hoy, I want to thank you for being with us. Hong Kong-based writer and reporter for the news outlet Quartz, reported on the extradition bill, has been covering the protests. We'll continue, of course, to cover all. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, a professor in Arizona is met with the response of a hung jury. They refused to convict him for aiding migrants in the brutal Sonoran desert. Stay with us. Lonesome Valley, performed by Shoo Shoo. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.
In Tucson, Arizona, a jury has refused to convict humanitarian activist Scott Warren, who faced up to 20 years in prison for providing water, food, clean clothes, and beds to 2 undocumented migrants crossing the Sonoran Desert in southern Arizona. Warren's trial ended Tuesday in a mistrial after a deadlocked jury was unable to deliver a verdict. 8 jurors thought Warren was not guilty. 4 thought he was guilty. A status hearing is scheduled for July 2nd. Prosecutors have declined to comment on whether they would seek a retrial against Warren. Warren briefly spoke to supporters outside Tucson's federal courthouse, where the hung jury was declared.
Since my arrest in January of 2018, at least 88 bodies were recovered from the Ajo corridor of the Arizona desert. We know that's a minimum number and that many more are out there and have not been found. The government's plan in the midst of this humanitarian crisis, policies to target undocumented people, refugees, and their families, prosecutions to criminalize humanitarian aid,